We have here a list of 3 people who attracted attention and had their impact. We have the Queen of the South, we have Jonah, we have Solomon, and yet the Lord says there is something greater than Jonah here. As a refrain, translate, there is something greater than, and put together all the celebrities of the universe here in this room. We have here, waiting to come in, the Lord of Glory. We cannot see them, but there where he comes, many angels are surrounding him with anxious expectation. And then when he comes, they are prostrate. It is something that we need to bear in mind every time we come into a place where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved. We have something greater than here. In Italy, I had a lot to do with nuns of perpetual adoration, and I noticed that the instinct might still be there to keep what was of obligation before, never to turn one's back on the Blessed Sacrament, because they had it exposed day and night. Indeed, when being trained in the monastery in Italy, I was warned during the formation there to celebrating Mass not to turn my back on the Blessed Sacrament. And for that to happen, there were rules which come back from as early as the Council of Trent. We, on a weekday, had kept the use of the high altar in its original place, facing eastwards, with incense every day, and the solemn high Mass was at 9:15 every morning, fully sung in Gregorian chant. It was only on a Sunday and holidays of obligation that we put the candles on the other side of that same high altar and faced the people. Therefore the question posed itself, after the consecration, the real presence is there, and yet twice during the celebration, after the consecration, the priest has to turn his back on the presence by then there. So how was it done? If he had to do that, he would not stand before it, but take one step to the right. And that was the gut reaction of every priest who would have been formed up until the Second Vatican Council. And I remember the priest who was forming me, my prior, explaining something similar with regard to the Archbishop. If you are standing before the Archbishop, you do not turn your back to him. And this protocol was there also in church circles. For instance, up until very recently, one would not walk backwards, rather with one's backside to the Holy Father. It was part of the discipline that one always avoided turning one's back on a person of such dignity. The Queen of England the same. And yet, now we glibly treat the Lord of Hosts, the King of Glory, the Judge of the world, the Alpha and the Omega, with far less respect than we would show to the greatest dignitaries of this world. He is actually, in his own house, the least thought about quite often. If one looks around, one observes that the first person that is greeted is not the Lord at all quite often, but so-and-so, on whom one catches up on the news. That is a fairly recent development. But there is also another side to it. We are actually harming ourselves in the process. I was just answering yesterday a letter to a person who had been saddened by yet another belittling of the Lord. It was the way in which, and this was not in Ireland but in another country, at the Ash Wednesday celebration, a week today, there had been this itch to get to the end as quickly as possible, and therefore to multiply the number of points at which these ashes were distributed, therefore handing them over to non-priests. And I think he wanted me to comment upon that, so I just pointed out to him that actually even in the new missal it is quite clear that it is the priest, and it said so, it's quite clear explicitly, who gives the blessed ashes, imposes them, that's the technical term. And there are reasons for that. When a priest blesses, makes the sign of the cross over, then since his ordination, that sign of the cross contains grace, blessing and healing. The layperson has not that power. And therefore what is happening is that two things are being lost in the celebration if lay people presume to come in on that realm and do things for which they are not commissioned or empowered. First of all, the grace that the Church is impetrating sacramentally, in this form sacramentals, not sacraments, but sacramentals, probably is either not being obtained or being obtained very little, because actually it's a human act in that point. The other thing is this, that the itch to speed up the most sacred moments of our life is also a great victory for the enemy of the soul and of the Creator. Because what is actually happening is this, that the most quiet moments, the privileged moments of encounter between heaven and earth are being squeezed out as much as possible in our already very busy day, as though the worst possible thing that could happen in our liturgical assemblies were to have a moment of silence. And therefore the Lord, rich in blessing, is finding that he has no time or space to expand those blessings on his creatures, because he's finding that his creatures are getting in the way. And he is no longer started to heal and to speak to souls, then he finds that his voice is being obliterated by many other things going on, including church notices, or the conclusion immediately of the celebration in such a way that it's one big agora of encounter on the human level, in which therefore, even when he's sacramentally present, he is not able to do what he came to do and wants to do generously and patiently with the suffering souls before him. He has his hands bound by his own creatures, and he cannot get through to them. I compare that with what actually used to happen in our monastery, even actually on a Sunday morning. There was a high proportion of young people there because we had many of them camping around. It was like a taser in Italy. And yet, they were exposed to about an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half of otherness in our celebrations when they would come from their tents and come in, along with those who might come also in buses, tourists, because they knew about the Gregorian chant, and it was kind of interesting as an experience for them. And we noticed that without in any way pandering to modernity, although actually we were very hospitable to what the young people wanted, at that solemn moment we found that by putting on extremely powerful music in the form of an organ and a flute, because we had musicians around, and a great pipe organ, by singing without actually organ accompaniment the Gregorian chant itself, which is the voice of the Middle Ages, in a church which was of perfect acoustic, it would go up and up and up and up and up. By filling that same building with clouds of otherness in the form of incense, and also by the use of the body in very suggestive liturgy, we found that things without huge modernity actually started to happen. We would notice at Holy Communion, for instance, that quite a few would come up with tears in their eyes, very much moved by being exposed to something greater than themselves. And we found, also by the reactions they might send in writing afterwards, that we, just by giving the Lord space, were allowing him at last to find souls and to find them in a certain isolation of tranquility. For that is where he works. A certain solitude and aloneness in an atmosphere that creates it and does not destroy it. I make a jump. Look across your shoulder in two directions. Firstly, to the east. Our brethren, who, although they do not receive them often, have the sacraments. And their notion of time is quite different. Even though they are not present for the 3 hours, they are present towards the last full hour, but the priest is already in celebration since the early hours of the morning. It's very long, very solemn. But what happens there? They actually say and sing very little to people. They go around and light candles, prostrate themselves, make many signs of the cross, but they enter into otherness. They are worked upon in a spirit and a place which brings them a little bit beyond where they're coming from. It allows them, just by the fringe, to touch the Blessed Trinity. Come then to the other side of things. In the West, our brethren, the Protestants, particularly, for instance, charismatics, you notice how they go about a session of healing. They are very good at creating, for long periods of time, if necessary, gentle sustenance, not invasion, but sustenance of music. An atmosphere created with gentleness and in some form of otherness, allowing people to be lifted up also by the emotions. When it's genuine, it actually creates a sacred space in their own mode where God is able actually to act and will act, wherever he finds souls open and genuinely praying. When writing back to my friend yesterday, I just took up one example. It was actually something which just the other day had happened to me. I was with actually people like yourself, very much into prayer, lovely people, pillars of prayer. But they had asked me to celebrate, not there, but on some occasion of my own, a Mass for their intentions with the family. I promised to do so, but then I added, would you like to be present? And if so, well, maybe the best thing actually to use a slot which is actually a public one, the Sunday one, that's the only public one I have, and to come there. It's the one that they've asked me to celebrate for the diocese in Latin on a Sunday at 1 o'clock. So just come there and I can apply it for yours. And so they went along with that and fixed a time, fixed a date. But then the first question was from one member of the family, roughly when would it be over? In other words, this question of time was the first thing in the back of that person's mind. I'm not judging now, I'm just quoting, because it's something which made me reflect. If that's the immediate reaction, where are we at? For people actually who are very much into prayer, spearheads of prayer, and yet that this notion of quantity can be so much paramount that quality is actually on the back burner. I just conclude. I was reading recently something which has been going around the clergy. It's the analysis of the situation with regard to the quality or absence thereof of homiletics. It has already been picked up since the Synod on the Word. Actually, Cardinal Brady, you wouldn't believe it, is the one who set the ball rolling. He asked, for the first one, he was the one who asked in a strong way, could we have some kind of directorium from the topmost level for the whole church as regards what is expected in preaching and how to have tips to go along with it. And it had been picked up, and it's going to happen apparently, but in that context this was being analysed and discussed. And one reaction from a priest in this discussion was this: in this particular country where we live, we have a big problem. It's the fact that, different from many other countries by now, priests maintain a very large number of celebrations, e.g. on a Sunday. And therefore, what actually happens, humanly speaking, is this: they go into functionary mode, and they do not have that care which they would have in some countries of a one central moment of preaching with a certain gusto and intensity. Whereas if they're repeating it 2 or 3 or even 4 times or 5 times if you include the vigil ones, the quality is bound to suffer. Do you see what we're at? And we've got used now to a situation where people will start complaining if he goes on for more than the usual, by now, 5 minutes. Now do you see what we're up against there? Compared with just what I was mentioning a minute ago, our brethren, e.g. the Protestants, the Charismatics, who will live for the sermon and live it throughout the week. It'll be the talking point amongst them quite often. There's a big difference. And I would ask you, in God's name, why should our standards be lower when we have something greater than Jonah here?
Fount of love and mercy, today we come, thy blessings to implore. Oh, touch our hearts, so cold and so ungrateful, and make them, Lord, thine own forevermore. Sweet Lord of Jesus, we implore.